The tracheobronchial tree is the conductive pathway that leads from the larynx down to the alveoli of the lungs. It starts with the trachea that arises at the lower border of cricoid cartilage in the neck as a continuation of the larynx. Then it travels inferiorly into the superior mediastinum and bifurcates at the level of the sternal angle, forming the right and left main bronchi. As it descends, the trachea is located anterior to the esophagus and inclines slightly to the right. The trachea, like all of the larger respiratory airways, is held open by cartilaginous C-shaped rings. The three ends of these rings are supported by the trachearis muscle. At the T45 level, trachea bifurcates into two main bronchi, and here we have a cartilaginous keel called carina that is richly innervated. So if anything actually makes it down there and touches that carina, that's going to cause a massive bronchospasm and would stimulate cough to hopefully eject the thing out. Along with branches of the pulmonary artery and veins, the main bronchi make up the roots of the lungs. Anatomically, the right and left main bronchi are slightly different. The right main bronchus is wider, shorter, and descends more vertically than its left-sided counterpart. Clinically, this results in a higher incidence of foreign body inhalation. The right superior lobal bronchus arises before the right main bronchus enters the hilum. The left main bronchus is narrower and it takes more horizontal path, passing inferior to the arch of the aorta and anteriorly to the thoracic aorta and esophagus in order to reach the hilum of the left lung. So these primary bronchi are going to divide into secondary bronchi. Secondary bronchi are going to serve the lobes of the lungs. Respectively, we have 3 secondary bronchi on the right side and 2 secondary bronchi on the left. Then secondary bronchi are going to spawn into tertiary bronchi. Those serve individual bronchopulmonary segments, which are surgically resectable segments of the lungs. Let's look at them. A bronchopulmonary segment is a portion of lung supplied by a specific segmental bronchus and its vessels. These arteries branch from the pulmonary and bronchial arteries and run together through the center of the segment. Veins and lymphatic vessels drain along the edges of the segment. These bronchopulmonary segments are separated from each other by layers of connective tissue that forms them into discrete anatomical and functional units. This separation means that a bronchopulmonary segment can be surgically removed without affecting the function of the others. There are approximately 9 to 10 bronchopulmonary segments on either sides. So we should have 19 or maybe 20 tertiary bronchi as we go. As you can see, the bronchopulmonary segments here are color-coded and numbered, and they correspond to the apical, posterior, and anterior segments of different parts of the lobes of the right or left lung, with some degree of variation. Now, one thing that is significant is that the superior segments of the inferior lobes, you can see them here as number 6, they tend to be important clinically with respect to the aspiration of materials for people that are confined to their beds. These tertiary bronchi, they face posteriorly, and so gravity is going to be able to conduct any materials, and this is usually liquids such as exudate, into these superior segments of the inferior lobes, unfortunately. The triangles of auscultation we discussed a bit earlier are overlying these particular segments on the back. Here you can see some of these bronchopulmonary segments. The superior lobe of the right lung contains the apical, the posterior, and the anterior segments. Then here is the middle lobe containing lateral and medial segments. Then there is that inferior lobe containing superior, those that are problematic for the people that are confined to their beds, anterior basal, lateral basal, posterior basal, and medial basal segments. In the left lung, the superior lobe is built of the apical, posterior, anterior, and lingual segments. The apical and posterior segments usually fuse into one apico-posterior segment, but sometimes both an apical and a posterior segment are present. Then the lingula consists of two segments, superior and inferior lingular segments. The segmentation of the inferior lobe of the left lung is very similar with the segmentation of the right side. Here we have a superior segment, a lateral basal, anterior basal, posterior basal, and a medial basal. And you can see them on this picture right here. I don't think that's very important that anyone spend much time memorizing all these segments, but I do think that it's interesting to see how these vary with respect to the different lobes. Knowledge of the anatomy of the bronchopulmonary segments is essential for precise interpretation of radiographs and other medical images of the lungs. Understanding of the localization of these segments is also essential for surgical resection of diseased segments. Bronchial and pulmonary disorders such as tumors or abscesses often localize in a bronchopulmonary segment, which may be surgically resected. During treatment of lung cancer, the surgeon may remove a whole lung, pneumoectomy, a lobectomy, or a bronchopulmonary segmentectomy. So we have three different types of procedures here. Those tertiary bronchi are going to divide into many generations of conducting bronchioles, which transport air but lack glands and are not involved in gas exchange. Conducting bronchioles then eventually enter the terminal bronchioles that are really at the end of the conductive zone. So it's here that we have a lot of smooth muscles that can control the lumen of the conductive pathway. But there is no real means to exchange gases yet. Those terminal bronchioles are going to host respiratory bronchioles. It's where we cross over from the conductive portion of the bronchial tree to the respiratory zone. The respiratory bronchioles host alveoli or the alveolar sacs, across which there is movements or conduction of oxygen and carbon dioxide and other gases as need be. Altogether, there are around 300 million alveoli in adult lungs, providing a large surface area for adequate gas exchange. The trachea, carina, as well as main and secondary bronchi may be visualized using a bronchoscope. This device has a camera attached to a flexible optic fiber. We can insert it through the nose and proceed down the trachea to enter the main bronchus, examining the structures around. As you see, some anesthetic solution is applied to the mucosa of the nose and pharynx. Then they introduce the flexible shaft of the bronchoscope through the right nasal cavity all the way down, passing the inferior nasal meatus, nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Now you see the laryngeal inlet with the epiglottis anteriorly, piriform recess laterally, and two vocal cords moving towards the midline and back apart in the center of the image. They guard the inlet to the trachea, and the space between the vocal cords, glottis, leads us to the lumen of the trachea. Now the lumen of the trachea doubles at the point called tracheal carina, and from here two main bronchi begin. And we are entering one of them to see the secondary bronchi further along the lumen, as the main bronchi, they branch too. Here you see how some pieces of bronchial wall are taken for biopsy.